Let me go back to the 60s and 70s. Multiple realizability is an idea that arose in the 60s and 70s because ideas about computation were being developed. Turing machine ideas, the first computer programs were being written. And in philosophy, this got imported as the idea that it doesn't really matter what kind of hardware you're working with. What matters is the software. So a Turing machine is just a big tape with squares on it and a head that moves around. It's not a real thing at all. It's basically a mathematical abstraction. And philosophers like Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor generalized from this to think that when we're thinking about the mind, we don't have to think about the hardware. It doesn't matter whether it's a brain or a computer. What matters is it's computing different kinds of functions. And so they developed an idea called functionalism, which says just look at the function, don't look at the hardware that's computing the function. So multiple realizability is a way of saying that you can realize thinking in different ways. You can realize it in a computer, you can realize it in a brain, maybe you can realize it in the force field in some alien intelligence. So you can ignore the hardware. This was actually, I think, a very plausible view in the 1960s and the 70s. And going into the 80s, and there are still lots of philosophers who take this as dogma. But already in the 1980s, it started to become implausible. Why? Because neural network ideas developed. They developed through brain scanning techniques, which meant you could look into brains for the first time and be able to say, oh, that means this part of the brain is being used, or that part of the brain. That was the new technology that really got developed in the 80s through different kinds of brain scans. But at the same time, in the 80s, ideas about neural networks started taking off. The idea of the brain as a parallel distributed processor that the PDP group came up with. So I published an article way back in the late 80s called Parallel Computation in the Mind-Body Problem, where I argued that multiple realizability was a problem. Because once you start looking at parallel computation and why it's got advantages over serial computation, you get a different story. So consider speed, for example. The Turing machine doesn't worry about speed, and abstract computation doesn't worry about speed. But if you're a living organism, like a human trying to survive in the jungle, you care about speed. So the fact that you can compute in a few milliseconds that there's a lion coming after you really matters. So once you bring time into it, parallel computation becomes very important. Now, parallel computation is a matter of hardware, not software. So computers nowadays have a little bit of parallelism. So if you buy a typical computer, it might have 4 cores in it or 16 cores, or maybe if you're really rich, 64 cores, which means it's got 64 different processors. So it's got a little bit of parallelism. But the parallelism in the brain is astonishing. You have 86 billion neurons, and they don't have a central clock. They're all just doing their own thing in coordination with each other, but not completely controlled. So the parallel computation enables brains, which have these really slow neurons, they maybe operate 100 times a second, immensely slower than the computer chips, to actually do wonderful things. And people are still way smarter than any computer that we've got running it. They show that in the book, Bots and Beasts. Right. So parallel computation was one hint. But the recent argument I gave on this issue of against multiple realizability, against the philosophical view called functionalism, was based on energy. So I mentioned earlier how I got into information because of this concern with energy. But the main point of the paper on energy that I just published is that if you look not just at time, but look at energy, it really matters a lot what the hardware is. So the brain not only has this marvelous property of parallel computation, it's astonishingly energy efficient. So I want to ask, your brain actually takes about 20% of your body's energy. It's surprising given that it's a small organ. But even so, it's only using, by current estimates, something like 40 watts of energy. That's hardly any energy to do more powerful things. So if you look at current supercomputers or programs that are doing things like IBM Watson or deep learning programs, or actually the worst case is the computers that are being used for Bitcoin mining, just one of the biggest travesties in current technology, you find massive uses of energy are required. And so the brain is actually really incredibly efficient. And so that's why computer science and theoretical neuroscience has developed a new field called neuromorphic computing, which I also learned about from Chris Eliasmith. So the idea is you want to make computers more like the brain in order to make them more energy efficient, because energy really matters. It matters to biological organisms like us because we don't have an infinite supply of energy, but it also matters to computers. It matters that Bitcoin takes the energy of a small country to be able to do its crazy mining operations. So energy matters to computing. That means that hardware matters because different kinds of energy run on different kinds of hardware, or put it differently, different kinds of hardware use different kinds of energy. So computers use electrical energy, but brains use biochemical energy, and that makes a big difference. That's why we have 100 different kinds of neurons and 100 different kinds of neurotransmitters. They're doing different things for timing and different things for energy. So if you're concerned at all with speed and energy, then you realize that multiple realizability and the philosophical doctrines it's built on, called functionalism or sometimes substrate independence, are implausible. And so that's what the new philosophy of science article is about.